The packet they handed me said 30 days. 30 days in the Veth Karath Wilderness Tier, rated Class 6 hostile terrain, intended for second-year combat cadets of Concordance Academy worlds with baseline endurance profiles above the 92nd percentile. I was a first-year exchange slot. The packet also said, in small print below the signature block, that no cadet had been formally assigned to the tier as an exchange student before. It noted this, the way a maintenance log notes an unusual reading, with mild interest and no suggestion that anything should change. I signed the intake form and went to get my kit. The kit station was in sub-level 4 of the Veth Karath Academy's logistics annex. It was staffed by a Dorothi administrator named Vel Saris, who had 4 arms, a permanent expression of administrative resignation, and a very precise way of setting things on the counter, with the exact force needed to convey disapproval without technically slamming anything down. She gave me a standard issue shelter membrane, a water reclamation filter in a rubberized case, a fire start kit with 6 ignition discs, ration blocks sealed in thermal wrap, and a signal beacon clipped to a carabiner. I looked at the filter. The rubberized case was cracked along one seam, compressed by something heavy, enough that the internal ceramic filtration disc would have fractured, turned it over. Vel Saris watched me with the expression of someone who expected me to sign the receipt and leave. This one's cracked, I said. The unit is rated functional. The housing is. The ceramic is fractured. The filtration membrane will be contaminated within 48 hours of use. Vel Saris pulled up something on her screen. She reviewed it for longer than a cracked filter casing warranted. I'll issue a replacement, she said eventually. The replacement was fine. I signed the receipt and took the stairs up to the staging courtyard, where the rest of the cohort was assembling. 3 cadets from 11 Concordance worlds, plus me. They were mostly tall, mostly configured for the bilateral radial skeleton that showed up in 60% of Concordance member species. Wide shoulders, long limbs, a forward-hinging knee joint that put their weight distribution somewhere between a human and a large bird. Some were iridescent, a few were not. They stood in motion in the flat gray morning light of Veth Karath's temperate zone, and their breath hung in the air in colors I didn't have names for. I had already noted Reth Dovel. He was not difficult to notice. He stood at the front of the loose formation the way someone stands, when they have decided that is their position. A shamf means at some earlier point. He was taller than most of the cohort by half a head, built wide across the chest in the rippled keratin plate fashion of his species. The Veth Ori homeworld ran at 1.3 standard gravity. Pale blue-gray plating over a darker underlayer, small movable crest of sensory spines along the crown, amber eyes set wide with excellent lateral range. The Veth Ori were predatory by evolutionary origin and hierarchical by social design, and Reth Dovel wore both of those facts like a second set of armor. He looked at me the way a very good athlete looks at a registration form that has an error on it. I had seen the look before, not from Veth Ori, from humans in the Cascades in the Atacama, on the survey rotations I'd run before the Concordance exchange program even existed. It was the look of someone calculating how quickly an obstacle would remove itself from their field of concern. I gave him a small nod and went to find a spot in the formation. The tier master was a Concordance officer named Instructor Vale Sorath. Short, heavily built, 4-limbed like most of the cadets, with a pale mineral gray skin tone of a species I hadn't cataloged yet, and a voice that could cut stone. She briefed us in Concordance Standard, which I had 6 months of and which I could follow about 90% of, the remaining 10% being mostly idiomatic Veth Ori expressions, for which there were no clean translations, only approximations like the sound the ground makes before something climbs out of it. The brief was thorough. Tier consisted of 3 biome zones, each roughly 10 days in duration. Zone 1, high-latitude temperate forest, non-lethal fauna, seasonal chill, navigable terrain. Zone 2, mineral flatlands, alkaline soil composition, reduced water availability, thermally variable. Zone 3, deep marsh, moderate toxicity in open water sources, biting insect analogs, soft ground. Cadets would be deployed in individual grid sectors. No contact permitted between sectors for the first 15 days, limited contact after. We would be scored on caloric intake, shelter construction, navigation accuracy, and water security at daily check-in pings. A cadet who could not sustain minimum vitals would trigger their beacon and be extracted. No shame in extraction, Instructor Vale Sorath said. The tier was designed to assess limits. Finding your limit was the point. She paused after that sentence, in a way that suggested she believed, based on prior experience, that a significant portion of the people in front of her would find theirs. She wasn't wrong, but she was wrong about which one of us would be the first. I didn't set up my shelter membrane on day one. There was a lean to potential in the eastern edge of my sector. 2 storm-fallen trees crossed at a cooperative angle, third leaning against them at roughly 50 degrees, with a dense understory of fern analog growth along the base. I spent the first 2 hours assessing the terrain, building a picture of water, fuel, and food availability in a 300-meter radius. Then I built a raised bed from cut saplings lashed with stripped inner bark, and covered the whole structure with layered fern fronds, leaving the shelter membrane folded and stowed. The membrane was good technology. It was also single-use, rated for approximately 14 days of sustained deployment before the adhesion layer degraded. I had 30 days. I would use the membrane in Zone 3, when the rain would be consistent and the ground moisture would make natural insulation impractical. In the meantime, the trees were free. I had a fire going by the end of day 1. The ignition discs were 6. I used one to get the initial coal and then built a friction kit from materials available in the sector. 6 discs did not cover 30 days, and there was no reason to treat them as anything other than emergency backup. The coal went into an insulated nest of powdered bark inside a folded piece of sap-sealed wood, set into the ground against the base of the central fallen tree, where it would stay warm overnight. The fire itself I kept small, efficient, impressive. The check-in ping came at dusk, a brief signal from the monitoring system built into the carabiner clip. I logged my vitals manually, calories estimated from 2 hours of foraging, water volume from the filter, shelter status, ping, and it transmitted. Then I banked the fire, settled into the raised bed, and slept. I was not warm exactly. The temperate zone at night was colder than the brief had implied, somewhere around 4 degrees Celsius, with the wind that found every gap in the fern frond layering. I had slept in conditions approximately as difficult, in the Borealis taiga and in the Atacama at altitude. Cold like this was not a threat, just a feature. I put the hood of my base layer up and adjusted my breathing and slept. Day 3, one of the cadets triggered their beacon. I knew because Instructor Vale Sorath's overhead ping that morning included a short system note, flagging the extraction. I didn't know who it was. I found out later. A Dorothi cadet named Vel Raeth had attempted to construct a shelter using the membrane across all 30 nights, and had deployed it fully on night 1, tearing a seam in the adhesion layer, and then been unable to maintain body temperature when the night 3 chill dropped lower than predicted. Velraith was 17 years old and had tested in the 94th percentile for endurance on his world scale. He had simply never been cold in the way that Zone 1 cold was cold. I felt something about that. Not contempt, which would have been unfair. More like the particular weight of knowing that some things can't be tested for until you're standing in them. On day 4, Reth Doval crossed into my sector. I heard him before I saw him, which was mostly because he wasn't making any effort to be quiet. The Veth Ori were ambush predators in their evolutionary line, which gave them excellent stillness when they chose it. Reth Doval in this moment was not choosing stillness. He was making the sound of someone who knows they are bigger than everything else in the forest and sees no reason to account for the possibility that this could ever not be true. I was at the water source, running the filter on a second batch when he came through the understory. He stopped at the edge of the small clearing and looked at my camp. He looked at it for a while with an expression I'd learned to read as evaluation. The slight forward lean of the crest spines, the very small movement of his lateral pupils as they swept the fire, the bed, food cache I'd hung from a branch with a strip of bark cord to keep it off the ground. Then he looked at me. "You were supposed to use the membrane," he said, in concordant standard. His voice had the low resonant quality of Vethori vocalization at rest. When they were not at rest, it went several registers lower and shook things. "I'm using it in Zone 3, I said. The membrane is for Zone 1. It is rated for Zone 1 temperatures. It's rated for 14 days. I have 30, so I'm using it in Zone 3. He was silent for a moment. His crest spines moved in a pattern I had cataloged from my pre-deployment reading as the Veth-Ori equivalent of a recalibration pause. The moment, when you've said something that does not compute, and the system is deciding whether to ask for clarification, or simply reclassify the source of the input. He reclassified. Your exchange cadet, he said, as if this explained something that previously had not been adequately explained. Yes. Earth. Yes. He looked at the camp again, at the lashed sapling bed, at the fire, at the food hanging from the branch. His expression did something complicated that I could not fully read because I didn't have enough data on Veth-Ori micro-expressions yet, and then he turned and went back the way he'd come. I let out a breath that I hadn't been consciously holding. I finished filtering the water. I should describe what he had come to do, because it became relevant later. I didn't know it then. I learned it during the debriefing. At the end of the tier, when the monitoring logs were reviewed and several discrepancies between cadets, sector activity and their kit inventories were flagged and explained. Reth Doval had been, in the 3 days prior, moving between adjacent sectors in the sleeping periods of his neighbors. He had taken a navigation component from a Solari cadet named Vel Hareth, explained why Vel Hareth's nav pings had started running 12 degrees off true on day 2, and he had been extracted on day 5 after walking 22 kilometers into the wrong part of the forest. He had compromised the water filter of a Dorathi cadet in the sector north of mine, explained that extraction, too. He had come to my sector, I think, to do something similar. He had looked at my setup and found there was no obvious single point to compromise. The filter was the filter, but I was using it properly and had already caught one cracked housing at issue and knew what a functional read looked like. The fire was friction-built and couldn't be unbuilt. The shelter was organic and could not be sabotaged in any way that I wouldn't simply rebuild, and so he left. I did not know any of this on day 4. I only knew that he had looked at my camp with a very specific quality of attention, and that, when he left with a particular economy of motion of a predator, who has decided this location is not worth the effort. I had been underestimated many times in my life. I had learned that the way to respond to underestimation was usually just to keep working. You could explain yourself, or you could simply produce evidence. The evidence was always better. On day 7, I found the berry analog. They were growing along the south-facing slope of the creek bank where the water had cut a shelf into the mineral soil, tight clusters of small dark fruit on a low creeping plant with waxy leaves. I spent about 40 minutes confirming they were what I thought they were. Not the species itself, obviously, since we were on a different planet, but something occupying a similar ecological niche with a similar root structure and the same alkaloid marker absence in the leaf surface that, on Earth, correlates with edibility in berry-class plants. I scraped a small amount of juice onto my wrist and waited 20 minutes. Mild surface reaction, no systemic response. I ate 3 and waited 4 hours. Nothing. I ate the rest of what I had gathered. It was about 1 kilogram. And then I went back and gathered 4 more. The caloric value was modest. The flavor was something between a blackberry and a very tired olive. But they were reliable, and they were there, and reliable is more useful than remarkable. On day 9, I built a small smoking rack from green saplings over a slow hardwood fire and processed the excess meat from a trap I'd set on day 6. The trap had been a figure 4 deadfall using a flat stone I'd found near the creek. Simple, structural, the kind of thing I'd been building since I was 19 on the Pacific Crest Trail survey. 2 of the local small fauna had walked into it in 3 days. I'd processed one immediately. The second I was smoking. Smoking meat over a slow fire takes about 6 to 8 hours for a piece that size. I had time. I spent it doing the nav work for the next grid, running projections for the Zone 2 transition, and thinking about what the mineral flatlands would need in terms of water strategy. The rack was 3 green saplings lashed between forked stakes with stripped inner bark. The same bark that had served as fire tinder on day 1 and as cord on days 2 through 8. Because the right material used correctly can do more than one thing, which is most of what field work actually is. Not genius, not luck. Just the habit of looking at what's there before deciding what's missing. On day 11, Instructor Vale Sorath's daily ping included a note addressed to the cohort as a group. It said that 7 cadets had been extracted, and reminded the remaining cadets that extraction was not failure. It also said that the water reclamation protocols in Zone 1 were to be treated as primary, not supplementary. I thought about Reth Doval and the 2 filters. I sent my day 11 vitals, caloric intake, well above minimum. Water security, sustained, shelter, functional. Navigation, on target. The ping came back with a small additional note from the monitoring system. It said, Cadet Khan, confirm shelter construction method. Membrane not logged as deployed. I confirmed. Natural materials, leaned pole construction, layer insulation. Membrane preserved for Zone 3 deployment. The ping took longer to respond than usual. Then, confirmed, noted. I went back to smoking the meat. The Zone 1 to Zone 2 transition happened on day 11, just after midday. The terrain simply changed. The tree line thinned. The soil went from dark loam to a pale mineral gray that compressed differently underfoot, and within 2 hours the last of the fern analogs had disappeared, and the landscape opened into a broad, flat expanse of pale soil, low mineral-encrusted ground cover, and a sky that was a slightly different shade of blue than Zone 1's, flatter, with less moisture in the air. I had read the Zone 2 brief carefully. The alkaline soil was not chemically hostile to skin contact but made water sourcing from ground level unreliable. The mineral content would overload the filter membranes within a day if you were using surface runoff directly. The safe water sources were the deep fissures in the mineral pan, where precipitation collected below the alkaline crust at depth, accessible by a narrow-bore probe or by identifying the surface indicator plants that grew above them. They were described in the brief. I had the description memorized. I had also brought a length of stripped bark cord and a section of straight sapling because a narrow-bore probe was, minimum, a straight stick and a way to lower it without losing it. The first fissure I found on day 12 was 18 meters from my Zone 2 camp, position identifiable by a low mat of gray-green ground cover with faintly reflective leaf surfaces. I ran the probe down 7 handspans and struck water at roughly 2 meters depth. The filter came out clean on the first pass. I logged the location, noted 2 more possible indicator plant clusters within 200 meters, and went to build a wind shelter. Zone 2 was exposed. The winds came from the northwest, steady and dry, and without the tree buffer of Zone 1, they were the primary thermal threat. I used the shelter membrane here, not because the temperatures warranted it. They were warmer than Zone 1 nights, surprisingly, but because the wind chill without a barrier would have been problematic for sustained sleep. I deployed the membrane across a low mineral rise on the eastern edge of my sector, sealed the edges with compacted mineral soil, and slept in a windbreak that was functionally a very low-tech tent. It worked. By day 15, 3 more cadets had been extracted. The daily ping said 12 total. The monitoring system sent me a note on day 15 that said, without preamble, Cadet Khan, water sourcing method Zone 2, please detail. I detailed it. Fissure probe, indicator plant identification, filter application. Response, method not listed in standard cadet toolkit. My response, method not restricted. Standard foraging logic applied to environmental indicators. Longer pause. Response, confirmed, noted. On day 16, Reth Devol appeared again. He came from the west, crossing the open mineral flatland in the late afternoon light, and this time he made no pretense of a casual approach. He walked directly to my camp. He stood at the edge of it and looked at it with the same evaluating its attention as before, and this time the evaluation ran longer. I was working. I had found a piece of flattened mineral stone the previous day, roughly 20 centimeters by 30, with a natural concavity in the center, and I had been using it as a grinding surface to reduce some of the dried berry analogs I'd carried from Zone 1 into a powder that would constitute in water and provide a more portable caloric supplement. It was not sophisticated. 12-year-old with a field guide could have done it. But it was useful. Doval watched me grind dried berries into powder with a flat rock for about 90 seconds. Then he said, "You have water." Yes. Been unable to locate the deep fissures. He said this with the particular flatness of someone who has decided that stating a fact is not the same as admitting a weakness. The indicator plants have slightly reflective surfaces. Gray-green, low mat, about knee height. They cluster above the water at the ground cover level. He looked at the terrain around him, as though the indicator plants might have suddenly become visible simply because I had described them. Which direction? I pointed east-northeast. He looked in that direction for a moment. I will require the filter, he said. I looked at him. The system filter, he clarified. Standard issue reclamation unit. I know what the filter is. You have one. He stopped. His crest spines moved through a pattern that was not the recalibration pause, but something more compressed. I no longer have access to mine. There was a quality to that sentence that I spent a moment examining. Then I said, what happened to it? It was misplaced during the zone transition. I looked at him for long enough that he would have known I was not accepting misplaced. He held the look with the flat amber gaze of a species that does not typically flinch. The filter is mine, I said finally. I'll take you to the water source. He was quiet. And then you'll navigate your own water from the indicators. There are at least 2 more clusters within 200 meters of where I found the first one. He was quiet for a moment more. Then he said, I understand. We walked east-northeast. I did not give him the filter. I stood at the fissure and ran a filtered water collection for him directly into the container I had been using for Zone 1 overflow storage, a sealed section of the bark and sap waterproofing I'd built in Zone 1, which I had not abandoned because it was still functional. I gave him the container. He drank. He found the indicator plants within 20 minutes, as I had said he would, once he knew what to look for. He didn't thank me. The Vethori have a social grammar around obligation that doesn't use the same constructs as gratitude. It uses something more, like a formal acknowledgement that a balance has been created and will eventually need to be resolved. I had read about it. He gave me a short, formal incline of his crest, which was apparently the minimal gesture that registered as acknowledgement in the record, and then he went back to his sector. I went back to grinding berries. On D-17, 2 more cadets were extracted. 14 total. The monitoring systems note said, remaining cohort has maintained all vital benchmarks. Well done. I noted that this was the first message that had said, well done, rather than simply confirmed. I did not know what to make of that. On day 18, I found the animal. It was approximately the size and general configuration of a badger, though it had 6 limbs and a bony cranial ridge that suggested it did something useful with its head in encounters with soil. It was alive when I found it, but barely. It had fallen into a deep fissure crack that had opened during what I guessed was a minor seismic event in previous night's early hours, because I had felt the ground move slightly around 0300. It was wedged in at about 1 meter depth, unable to use its limbs effectively in the constriction. I spent about 40 minutes getting it out, not because the tier required it, not because it would help my score, but because it was alive and stuck, and 40 minutes of effort was not an unreasonable price for a life, even a small one. When I got it out, it bit me, which I respected. The bite was minor, a surface puncture, not a toxicological concern, checked the wound margins and found nothing that suggested venom. And I let it go, and it went, with the indignant haste of something that has decided the past hour was someone else's fault. I cleaned the bite and went back to work. On day 19, the first day of Zone 3 approached. I could smell the moisture changing in the air before the terrain shifted, a heavy green smell that was both familiar and wrong, in the particular way that alien ecology is always wrong. Everything in the right category, but none of the details matching. It smelled like a river delta. It was not a river delta. The olfactory signal triggered something in the back of my brainstem that had logged 2 months in the Louisiana bayou during my coastal ecology and was prepared to treat this as roughly equivalent. Zone 3. The marsh stretched south and east as far as the morning visibility allowed, which was not far. A thin mist sat at about 2 meters above the surface, and the light came through it flat and gray and even. The vegetation was dense. Tall reeds of something fibrous and hollow, clumps of a broad-leafed plant at water level, scattered low trees with root systems that arched above the waterline and then drove back in, making the ground navigation a matter of stepping from root arch to root arch, or accepting that you would be in the water. The water was the issue. The brief had been clear. Open water toxicity was moderate, meaning the filtration required double-pass protocol, and the membrane filter would degrade faster under the mineral load from Zone 2 if I hadn't been careful about flushing it. I had been careful. The filter was clean. I deployed the shelter membrane on the first afternoon, stretched between two of the arch root systems at about hip height, creating a sleeping platform that kept me off the ground and out of the standing water. The membrane sealed well. The night was warm. Zone 3 was the warmest of the 3 zones, and the insects came. They were not insects. They were the insect analog the brief had mentioned. Small, fast, hexapodal, proboscis, designed for something the brief described as dermal puncture feeding. In practice, they behaved like mosquitoes. I had a head net in my kit. Not issued, brought from home. A simple piece of fine mesh material that I had packed on the theory that insects are everywhere and most of them bite. I wore it. They bit whatever they could reach through the mesh. I noted the bites, treated them with the basic antiseptic in the kit, and slept. On day 21, Reth Doval arrived in Zone 3. He looked, for the first time, like someone who was finding the tier difficult. He was not broken. I want to be precise about that. The Veth Ori do not break in a fashion that is easily visible. They compress, the way high-grade materials compress under load, storing strain internally without visible deformation. But the compression was there. In the slight forward hunch he'd developed, the way his crest spines lay flatter than I'd seen them before, the quality of stillness in his eyes that was not the predator's alert stillness, but the stillness of something managing a resource deficit. He had found the marsh the way anyone finds the marsh who arrives without the right framing, as a sequence of problems that each had to be individually negotiated. The water, the ground, the insects, the root arch navigation, species that process terrain via visual spatial modeling, tuned to open grassland and structured forest, which the Veth Ori were, evolutionarily. A marsh environment was specifically disorienting, because the ground reference was inconsistent and the horizon was obscured. He had been navigating for 2 days without a reliable horizon. He didn't say this. He said, "The marsh sector transition is generating navigation errors." I said, "Yes. The mist cuts your sightline. You need to use the reed clusters as landmark sets instead of distant reference points. They're spaced irregularly, but the pattern is consistent if you map the first 20 meters and then project." He looked at the reeds. "They're hollow," I said. "If you drive a fruit stake through the root base and mark it, the stake stays visible above the waterline as a reference. You can map a grid out of them." He didn't ask me how I knew they were hollow. He just processed the information with the compressed efficiency of someone who has set aside their pride for the moment in order to survive and will pick the pride back up once survival is secured. I helped him mark 4 reference stakes in his sector boundary before we lost the light. Then I went back to my platform and slept. Day 22 brought the rain. Zone 3 rain was not the Cascades. It was warmer, steadier, without the cold driving edge that Pacific rain has. It also was not the Atacama, which barely had rain at all. It was more like monsoon, not violent, just persistent, the kind of rain that gets into everything because it has time and gravity and no particular reason to stop. The membrane held. The root arch platforms held, mostly. The fire required more effort to maintain, because the fuel sources in the marsh were universally damp, and damp fuel means smoke before flame. I knew what to do with damp fuel. I had been doing it since I was 22, in the Cameroon Basin with a forestry survey team that had packed for a dry season and arrived in a wet one. You split the wood, you expose the dry heartwood, you build your tinder stage from the interior fibers, and you give the fire more air and less distance to travel to reach dry material. It takes 3 times as long as starting a fire in good conditions. It still starts. On day 24, the smokehouse became practical. I had been accumulating excess protein since Zone 1, not by overhunting, because the trap method produces more than you eat in a given day if the local fauna is active, and Zone 3 had a significant amount of local fauna that was active. The broadleaf root systems were habitat for something that behaved like a fish and tasted, I estimated, like a mildly metallic shrimp. They were not difficult to catch in volume. I was eating well above minimum. I had been for 24 days. A smokehouse's marsh conditions requires an enclosed structure with a restricted outflow, a fire source you can bank and leave, fuel that will produce a long, slow smoke, and a rack to hang the product on. The enclosed structure was the membrane, rigged between 4 root arch supports in a rough cube with a folded corner venting downwind. The fire was a slow hardwood ember. I had found 2 pieces of what I suspected was a local equivalent of oak at the Zone 2 boundary, and carried exactly this use. The fuel for smoke was damp reed bundled and set over the ember. The rack was split green sapling lashed across the interior frame. It was not a smokehouse in any technical sense. It was a smoke tent. But it produced a sustained low-smoke environment for approximately 8 hours. It was sufficient to begin preservation of the excess protein I would otherwise have left behind. I was not building it because I needed it. I was building it because I had time and materials and a surplus, and it seemed like the correct use of all 3. On day 25, received a monitoring system ping that said, Cadet Con, daily vitals received. Query, structure logged at grid position 44 Keth. Please identify purpose, I said. Protein preservation. Tent over surplus catch for extended storage, the ping said. Confirmed, noted. It did not say, well done this time. I thought it might have been computing something. Reth Doval came on day 26 with the insect bites. He came in the early morning when the mist was still thick, and the reed clusters were barely visible past 20 meters, and he was moving without his usual deliberate pace, which told me more than anything about his condition. The bites were bad, not emergency level, not the kind that required beacon activation, but the insect analogs had found the vulnerable points of his anatomy and worked on them with the steady patience that small creatures have always applied to large ones. There were points along his neck membrane where the dermal layers had been repeatedly punctured, and the secondary fluid response, which in veterinary biology serves roughly the function of histamine response in humans, had produced a raised, hardened irritation that was clearly affecting his range of neck motion, and, by extension, his ability to use his lateral vision properly. He was not going to say he needed help, I said. The sites need to be dressed before the secondary response progresses past the membrane layers. Do you have antiseptic in your kit? Yes. Have you been using it? A pause. The kit has been depleted in some areas. I gave him the antiseptic. I also gave him the head net, which I had been wearing continuously for 6 nights, and which had done its job. He needed it more than I did now. In terms of the bite's effect on function, his lateral vision, being uncompromised, was a more significant practical problem than the irritation I was managing. Put the head net on with the expression of someone recalibrating what dignity requires in a given context. The vegetation oils from the broadleaf base, I said, also reduce attractiveness to the biting insects. If you compress the leaves and spread the oil on exposed surfaces, it wears off in 4 to 5 hours, but it gives you sleep windows. You determined this empirically. Yes. On day 20, he processed that. You have been here since day 20, day 19, and you have developed countermeasures since day 20. Trial and error. The first night I used the wrong leaves and they just smelled bad. The second night, I used the correct ones, and the bites reduced significantly. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that I did not have a full read on, but that carried something in it that was not contempt and was simple evaluation and was not quite respect either. It was something more complicated. The expression of someone who has spent 26 days being very confident about what competence looks like and has recently received enough contrary evidence to begin a genuine revision. Show me the plant, he said. I showed him the plant. On day 27, 2 more cadets were extracted. The monitoring system said, 18 cadets remaining, 26 extracted, daily minimum vitals, all active cadets holding. I was doing the geometry on that and found it interesting. 18 remaining from 44 starting meant 26 extracted, yes. Of the 18 remaining, I had now had direct interaction with exactly 1, Reth Doval. I had no information on the other 17. I didn't know if they were thriving or merely surviving. I didn't know what they were eating or how their shelters were holding. I knew only what my sector showed me, which was Zone 3 marsh on day 27, a smoke tent with 3 days of cured surplus protein in it, A working water source, a sleeping platform that had not failed in 8 nights of use, and a fire. The fire was what I thought about most, in the evenings. Not the logistics of it, those were solved more or less, but the quality of it. The way a fire in the dark is its own argument for why you are still here, because you built it, because you are warm, because the planet's opinion of your presence has been registered and answered. Earth had taught me that. 30 years of Earth, plus 7 years of fieldwork on terrain that was reliably trying to kill me through cold or altitude or thirst or institutional indifference, had taught me that the world does not argue with a fire. It simply notes that you are the kind of thing that makes them. The tier had been designed by people who understood survival as a maximum tolerance, a ceiling. They had built it to find the ceiling. What they hadn't modeled for was someone who had been living above their ceiling since she was old enough to carry a pack. I thought about that in the marsh on day 27, with the reed smoke rising through the membrane and the insect analogs, working on the world beyond it, ANS. And I thought that whatever the Veth Karath wilderness tier was designed to measure, it was measuring the wrong end of the equation. It was designed to find the point at which a cadet would break. It hadn't considered that some cadets might arrive already past every breaking point. It knew how to apply. That wasn't arrogance, it was arithmetic. On day 28, Reth Doval did something unexpected. He came to my sector in the mid-afternoon, when the rain had paused, and the mist had lifted somewhat, giving the marsh a cleaner gray light, and he brought with him 2 of the root arc crayfish analogs he had caught using the trap method I had described on day 21 during the navigation. Conversation. He set them down at the edge of my camp with the precise formal economy of a gesture that he had clearly thought about. He said, "The smoke tent surplus." I looked at the animals and then at him. "The balance," he said, in a tone that was explaining something rather than requesting anything. The water on day 16. The navigation reference. The antiseptic. The insect countermeasure. He stopped. I do not have a suitable medium of resolution in this environment. The catch is the closest available. I understand, I said. The Vethori protocol for unresolved obligation is specific. I've read it. He paused at that. You've read the Vethori protocol for debt acknowledgement. I read social protocols for every species in the cohort before I came. It seemed useful. Another pause. The crest spines did something that my limited dataset suggested might be the Vethori expression for something between surprised and recalculating. And the water filter in logistics on day 0. The filter housing was cracked. The ceramic would have fractured. You caught it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The marsh sounds filled the space, the distant percussion of the insect analogs, the water movement through the root systems, the low creak of the reed clusters in the wind off the southern section from. Then he said, not loudly, "How long has your world been like this?" I said. "Like what?" "The way it is that produces this." He gestured without specifying, at the camp, the smoke tent. At what I had done with 30 days of hostile terrain. I thought about how to answer that honestly without giving a geology lecture. "A long time," I said. "We had to be, or we didn't last." He looked at the camp for another moment. Then he inclined his crest again. The formal acknowledgement gesture, slightly deeper this time than on day 16. Then he went back to his sector. I added his catch to the smoke tent. Day 29 was quiet. I spent it doing the final nav survey, running the confirmation pings on all logged resources, checking the filter's integrity for one final time, and eating a meal that was better than anything the standard issue ration block would have provided at any point in the 30 days. Cured marsh analog protein, reconstituted berry powder in water, with some dried mineral soil herbs I'd found on the Zone 2 boundary that added something bitter and clean to the taste. And the last 2 of the Zone 1 ignition discs that I'd never used, I burned in a small celebratory fire. Not because I needed them, but because carrying weight out that I'd carried in felt like leaving something. Shen, unresolved. The fire said what it said. On day 30 at 700, the extraction signal came. It was a tone from the Kerprameter beacon, 3 rising notes, indicating the landing zone was active, and cadets should proceed to their assigned extraction grid. I packed down the camp with the particular methodical efficiency of someone who has packed down 30 camps in 30 days and has reduced the process to its minimum time and motion. Membrane folded, filter stowed, kit assembled, fire banked, and then fully extinguished with a water flush over the coal bed. I left the smoke tent frame standing. There was no reason to dismantle it. It wasn't mine and it wasn't in anyone's way, and it was well built. I picked up my kit and walked to the extraction grid. Reth Doval was already there. He stood at the grid marker with his kit assembled, his crest spines at rest, his eyes on the approaching extraction craft that was coming in from the northwest over the reed line. He looked like someone who had made it through something by the precise application of everything he had. He did not look like someone who had been beaten by 30 days in a marsh. Though he had been harder hit than he would have preferred. He did not look at me as I came up. Then he did. He said the smoke tent is a functional structure. It held the construction method, the membrane as enclosure, the ember-fed smoke source, the sapling rack. It is not in the tier training materials. No, you developed it in Zone 3 conditions. I adapted a method I'd used before. Different materials, same principle. He looked at the approaching craft. I will include the method in my after-action documentation, I said. To adaptive field improvisation in Zone 3 marshy terrain. The materials are specific to this tier's biome. He said, yes. And then, after a moment, you do not require attribution? No, but you would not object to it. I thought about that for a moment. It's accurate, I said. Attribution to accurate information is just correct record keeping. His crest moved in the pattern I had decided was recalibration. Agreed, he said. The craft came down in a wash of displaced air and reed fragments, settling on the grid with the solid thump of military transport. The hatch opened. Instructor Vale Sorath was visible in the bay, her mineral gray face expressionless in the way it had been on day 0. She looked at the two of us. Then she looked past us at the marsh, at the camp I had come from, at whatever the aerial scan was showing her on her data display. She looked at me. Cadet Khan, she said. The monitoring system flagged 17 queries to your sector over 30 days. Yes, instructor. Query regarding non-standard construction methods, non-standard water sourcing, non-standard food processing, non-standard protein preservation. Yes, instructor. She held the data display up briefly so I could see it. It showed a summary output, my daily vitals across 30 days, mapped against the cohort baseline. The baseline was a curve that declined steadily, with 26 extraction points marked along it. My line ran flat and then around day 14 began to trend slightly upward. Calorically, she said, you are the only cadet in tier history whose output improved during Zone 3. I didn't say anything. The smoke tent, she said. Yes, instructor. We have no category for it in the scoring matrix. I'll describe the method in the after-action write-up if that helps. She looked at me for another moment. Her expression did something that was too subtle for me to read cleanly, though it was not the administrative resignation of Velsaris in logistics, and it was not the threat assessment evaluation of Reth Doval on day 4. It was something closer to the look a very experienced person gives when they encounter something that is genuinely new. Board the craft, Cadet Khan, she said. I boarded the craft. Reth Doval boarded behind me. We sat across from each other in the bay as the hatch sealed and the craft lifted, and the marsh fell away below us through the small observation port. The reed clusters, the standing water, the root arch systems, and somewhere in there a smoke tent made of a shelter membrane and green sapling and a slow ember, standing in the rain. I watched it until the mist closed over it. The debriefing was 3 days later, after medical clearance and the initial after-action processing. 18 cadets present. 26 extraction reports filed. Instructor Vale Sorath ran through the tier's outcomes, the aggregate data, the individual sector performance, the flagged incidents. She read Reth Doval's name twice in the flagged incidents section, once for the navigation component from Velharith's kit, and once for the water filter from the North Sector cadet. He sat through both readings with the compressed stillness I had cataloged as his management posture. He did not look at me. Shh. When she was done with the flagged incidents, she said that the review board would determine appropriate outcomes and that the debriefing would not judge those outcomes. Then she moved on to the scoring summary. She read my name in the context of 9 different non-standard method flags, each of which she summarized briefly. Natural shelter construction, friction fire start, fissure water sourcing, berry analog identification and processing, deadfall trap design, smoke preservation method, insect repellent plant identification, leaf oil application protocol, raised sleeping platform in Zone 3. She said, Cadet Khan's score in the tier's caloric, water security, and shelter categories is the highest recorded in the program's 23-year history. Overall score falls outside the top bracket of the existing scoring matrix, which was calibrated for a maximum performance ceiling based on the program's prior record. We are adjusting the ceiling. 18 cadets in a room. The sound was the environmental hum of the building's air system and nothing else. I looked at the table in front of me. I thought about a fire in the dark, in a marsh on an alien planet, and the particular quality of a world that doesn't argue with the fact of you. I thought about 30 years of Earth, which is a survival tier that never ends and doesn't care about your score. I thought about Reth Doval on day 28, setting 2 crayfish analogs at the edge of my camp with the precise formal economy of someone balancing a ledger. I thought that the ceiling was probably fine where it had been. The problem was just that nobody had sent a human through before. Instructor Vale Sorath finished the summary and dismissed the debriefing. Cadets filed out. I gathered my documentation folder and stood, and as I turned toward the door, Reth Doval was there. He had waited, which was its own statement, he said, in a voice pitched for the 2 of us and not for the room. The smoke tent was included in my after-action documentation, method attributed. Thank you, I said. The balance, he said, remains unresolved. The water sourcing, the navigation, the antiseptic. A pause. The head net. The head net was alone. I got it back. The antiseptic was not. No. He was quiet for a moment. I will carry the balance, he said. It was not a question. All right, I said. He inclined his crest. The angle was the deepest I had seen him use. Then he walked out, stood in the empty debriefing room for a moment. Outside the window, the Veth Karath Academy grounds were bright in the afternoon light. The training yards, the administration towers, the long walk to the logistics annex where Velsaceres was probably, at this moment, setting something on a counter with the force of restrained disapproval. Somewhere in the tier, a smoke tent was still standing. I picked up my folder and went to write the after-action report.